Welcome to the Bonhoeffer Project podcast. My name is Dan Leitz. I'm here with my co-host, Stephen Kimbrell. Stephen, would you take a moment to introduce our guest?
Absolutely, guys. Welcome to the show. And we are excited to have with us on the show today Aaron Pierce. He's a personal friend of mine. He's also a discipleship first guy, and he's the multiplication pastor at Peace Church in Wilson, North Carolina. Aaron, good to have you.
Yeah, man. Glad to be here.
One of the things I'm finding out is you've got a lot of friends. This is one thing that I'm finding out.
That's not true. I just have a few, and I invite them on the podcast.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So pickings are slim after this. We're all done. We've exhausted your friends list. Oh, this is great. Aaron, it's great to have you here. And, you know, there's something interesting. Obviously, your title, multiplication pastor, it comes with an inherent kind of mandate, like the job description is in the title itself. Help us understand, just give us a little bit more of like the nuts and bolts. What does that mean when you have that title, number one, and then what does it look like nuts and bolts on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. So first of all, I do want to say thanks for having me. And also, Stephen, thanks for remembering my name. I was a little worried about that. So we're good about it. No, so multiplication pastor, I get funny looks like around here, even for people when they come into our new members class, like what in the world does that mean? So broadly speaking, I oversee our discipleship pathway, the environments that we use to try to create intentional disciple-making movements. And so that's kind of the 30,000 foot view. In a very simple way, what it means is we believe as every follower of Christ, we are to multiply ourselves into others. And so that happens as individuals, it happens in families, it happens larger scale, like in the environments themselves. So groups, for example, don't just stay together forever, they multiply. And then even our big initiative as a church is we want to plant 5 churches that plant churches by 2030. And so we're seeing multiplication happen at every level from individual to the church as a whole.
That's awesome.
So, Aaron, there's a lot that I want to dig into today, and I want to get into you mentioned the pathway, and I think that's so important for churches to think about a strategic way to make disciples in their context. And I want to get to that, but I know you guys as a church, you really made a significant shift in the last, 5 to 10 years, really just focusing in on making disciples. And we've talked about that a lot on the podcast. I know, Dan, your church here has gone through that shift or is going through that. And so could you just take us back and like what sparked that in your church and how's that been going?
Yeah, so Peace Church is over 50 years old. And for the longest bit of time, we had a lot of, if we even go back just to the history, it goes up as far as attendance. We would see growth year over year, and we got bigger and built more buildings. But at some point in about the mid 2000s, so I came on staff in 2014, but in about 2006, I think they hired a guy to kind of start moving towards discipleship. They were hearing about it. And what it really was is they were seeing a lot of people come. We had a lot of programs and our budgets look good, all that, but we're going, these people aren't maturing. Like we're not seeing multiplication. We're just seeing a bunch of butts and seats. We're not seeing people's really like catching fire and it's not spreading. We're not reaching, lost people. And so Doug Rogers actually came on. He's a mentor of mine now. He's a great guy. I think you know him too, Stephen.
Yeah.
He's one of those friends.
He's on the podcast next.
So he actually was on the mission field. He grew up in Mexico, was involved in a lot of that stuff from his dad being a missionary. And so he came back to the States, was on staff for, I believe, like 8 years. And he really started this idea that we need to personally make disciples, and they implemented some things. But per just where they were at as far as our staff, it was very much like, we're going to add discipleship to the other million programs we have and just hope that does something. And that wasn't Doug's intention. And I don't even think it was our staff's intention. We were just learning.
Yeah. And
so Doug ended up feeling called back to Mexico, and he started a crazy church planting network there. I think they've got like 35 churches he's planted since 2014 with indigenous people. He's not doing it himself. He's actually raising up leaders and they're planting their own churches. But so 2014, I come on and we started to make the shift to say, guys, discipleship isn't like another slice of the pie, that there's more to the church than that. Discipleship has to be the whole thing. And so that was really when the shift began. And in 2016, we did some vision scrub and as a staff, and then really realigned ourselves to say, how do we point everything back to getting people into environments to help them grow and mature and make disciples?
Let me ask you this. How did that look with you personally? Like, when did this, I mean, most of us, again, within the Bonhoeffer Project, all of us can kind of trace it back to like the epiphany moment, the light bulb moment, when we're like realizing that we've been making discipleship a piece of the pie, like you said. What was that moment like for you when you realized, okay, oh, it's the whole pie. Like, I've missed it. It permeates the whole thing.
So I actually realized that when I was in grad school, the year before I came on staff. I knew personally, like, as a young age, I was probably 14 when I really understood, okay, like, being a follower of Jesus means actually following Jesus, not just doing good stuff. And so I began to pursue Christ in that way. And I would look around, and it wasn't anything to me. I would just say, man, like, how are so many people functioning without like truly seeking to follow Christ? Like, nobody was talking about it. And so I was just kind of had this fire in me. And then in grad school, I actually worked with, I was actually at Liberty University. I started there and finished at Southeastern later. But at Liberty, I actually was working with an organization that worked with NAM for church planting. And I would just meet some of these guys and hear them talk and think, they're saying exactly what I've been feeling since I was young, that church has to be about making disciples above all. And so when I came to Peace and they were already asking me to kind of take the role that Doug was doing, I already had a bit of that framework. And then through them, and then there's a church up the road actually in Raleigh that some of their guys kind of spoke into me at Summit Church where JD Greer's at. And so, man, they started pouring in. I'm thinking, man, all this connected where I'm going, we got to make disciples. And like, that's the main thing. Like, it doesn't matter if there's a bunch of people here on Sunday morning if they're not following Christ, if we're not making disciples. And so that's where that fire kind of started for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Aaron, we were talking before the show came on, before we started recording, and we were just talking about, the concept of a pathway and that kind of thing. But you mentioned then the fact that, some people want to jump straight to the pathway. They want to jump straight to, like, give me the tools, give me the book, give me the silver bullet. But you mentioned that it's got to rest in a culture that understands and values discipleship. So that sounds good. There's a lot of talk about culture today, but like, how does that play out in a church, and how do you go about creating that culture?
Man, I think the greatest mistake I personally made was assuming, because I understood it, that if we just built the system, everybody in the church would get it. And the reason we did a vision scrub in 2016 is I was starting to say things and we were starting to do things back in 2014. In many ways, the things that we're doing now, but we were just assuming if we build it, they'll come, without creating the culture or the framework. And so we're using language that people didn't know. And for most people, I think, unless you plan a church with that at the onset, you have to kind of shift the mindset from church is where I go, it's where I pay my dues and I hear a good sermon and I leave, versus I'm actually called on mission with Christ to make disciples, and the church is just where we gather to sort of embody that mission as a whole. And that was hard. Honestly, we're still not there. I mean, there are still the crazy statements made or questions made. Like, I remember early on some people saying things like, why am I supposed to make disciples? That's what we pay you to do. And I'm like, oh, wow, they actually like don't get it. Like, and so I realized, man,
you're the multiplication guy, right?
That's what,
that's your job.
You're literally, it's in your title. And so I think that cultural element is, honestly, it's the fuel to keep the thing going, because anybody can build a system. And if you just plug and play, it sounds good in theory, but there's no movement until there's buy-in. And there's buy-in when we create a culture that says, this is what we value and this is how discipleship should look.
Yeah. As you're talking, again, you're piquing my interest, but I want to talk. So the way that I see you, you're probably at least 3 to 5 years down the road from where we are in my church context. Help me just maybe describe, even for our audience, because one of the things that we've noticed in the Bonhoeffer Project is one of the big hurdles that people have when it comes to overcoming kind of this fear of culture change is really the fear in change itself. How do we do this? How's it go? What are people going to think? So it's a two-part question. What are kind of some of the things that you've seen? You've already expressed one of them. People are like, that's what I pay you to do. So what are the things that you've seen that have been hard to overcome, and what are some of the successes that you've had that you're like, this made it all worth it?
So I think the two biggest hurdles for us in creating culture, one was we're not in a huge city. So Wilson's about 55,000 people. We're somewhat close to bigger cities, but we're more of a traditional smaller city. And I don't say this for us. I'm just saying have been for a while the largest church in our city as far as attendance. And so when people hear, why are we changing things? Look, right. It's what we're doing is working. Mm-hmm. But they're using the test of, look at all the people here versus, are we making disciples? Are we multiplying the kingdom? And man, that's been hard, because I think people say, why are you changing up things? Why are we creating these environments? Why are you telling me I got to disciple people when there's 1,000 people in the state, in the pews? And so that's been hard, and in some ways victim of success of the wrong idea.
Yeah.
Not that church growth is bad, but church growth for its own self, that's not advancing the kingdom. And I'll say this, 98% of our church growth in those early years, and even for the first few years I was here, was people coming from other churches.
Right.
Yeah.
So we weren't making disciples. We're just getting people who are bored at their place, or maybe legitimately a switch or something, but it's like, man, we're not here to swap sheep.
Yeah.
We want to advance the kingdom. And so that was a huge one. The other thing that happens for us.
Doesn't it say that heaven celebrates when a person swaps churches? Isn't that what it says?
I think that's a different translation.
Okay.
Yeah,
maybe
you might want to check. Yeah, we'll pray about that.
Maybe it's salvation when a sinner comes home, right?
Yeah, something like that.
Sorry, Aaron. Go ahead.
No, I love that. So, that, and then the other side that's really bizarre for us, and there's not a lot of churches that I've talked to that have dealt with this, but when Doug came in and we did discipleship as, sort of an onset or something that we did in addition to other things. So when I say discipleship now, there are several people in our church who go, man, that's great.
Yeah.
And you're one of those discipleship people. That's cool for you. I'm going to do the other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's hard because they're not necessarily even disagreeing with the idea of it. They're just thinking that's one of my many options here because that's what we've done. And so, man, that's been a huge hurdle to try to get people to say, no, everybody is called to the Great Commission. It's not just your thing because that's your thing. But because we've been a church that existed as this litany of programs, they kind of pick and choose, and discipleship could be or maybe isn't for a lot of people. And so I'd say those are the two biggest hurdles culturally we're still battling with, still fighting. And as a result of that too, that some of those changes of environments, people lose environments that they were used to. And so that creates fear. I think it was Will Mancini who said, people don't don't feel change, they fear loss. Right. And so it's removal of things that it gets them. And so those are the challenges. But honestly, the successes have been when we got people to buy in, and we started seeing, second, third, and even fourth generation discipleship, where a guy I disciple who then goes on to disciple somebody else, and then, goes all the way to the fourth generation. And it's just amazing. In fact, some of the people in the church plant, Stephen alluded to this earlier. I don't remember if we were even recording then, but when we were talking, that our church actually sent out some people that was in conjunction with the Amos, who was out of Grace City Church from Stephen's church. He came and did a residency, and we sent 13 people from our church to go plant. Some of those guys were guys that we had discipled 5 years ago, who then discipled other people. And so we got to see them not only own discipleship themselves, but now they're literally moving across the country to advance the kingdom and continue that elsewhere because they caught the vision of making disciples. And so stuff like that is just really cool when you can see personal examples of people you invest in that are in the third and fourth generation of discipleship a few years down the road. It doesn't get better than that for me. It's just exciting.
That's so cool. And I think about, Bill's quote that disciples are God's gift to the world.
Amen.
And so the investment that your church is making, not only are you making disciples that are God's gift to Wilson, North Carolina, and they're impacting, where they live, work, and play Monday through Saturday, but you're impacting Chula Vista, California, because of discipleship that happened in your church. Yeah. These people realize, hang on, this Christianity thing's not all about me. It's about me following Jesus. It's about me reaching others, making disciples. And that led them to move from one side of the country all the way to the other to make disciples. And what a beautiful representation of how disciples really are God's gift to the world.
Absolutely, right? Gosh, I mean, it just gets me excited.
Yeah, and honestly, for us as a church, that was last May when we sent them out. That was one of those milestone moments for us at creating culture, because we had people come to us and go, how did so-and-so who I knew 5 years ago say yes to moving to California? Because they've got kids, they've had careers here. And the craziest part of it is all 13 people that moved were born and raised and lived only in Wilson.
Wow.
Nobody had ever lived anywhere else. And so we got to tell them, look, like, you remember they talked about their D groups, they talked about discipling, those environments in our pathway. And they're like, oh yeah, maybe I should try that. Like, we've been saying that, but hey, like whatever works, but that led other people to want to get involved, and it just kind of spurs on. That's culture. I mean, when they see the wins and they celebrate it, what you celebrate, or what you celebrate, you replicate, right? And so that whole thing just begins to spur on movement that's exciting.
That's awesome. So that culture, you guys have, obviously it's still a work in progress, right? Like you're celebrating it, you're doing things to reinforce that culture. But, you talked about that pathway, that rest in that culture, and that does give some structure to what you guys are doing in your church. So can you talk to us a little bit about, maybe if someone's listening, they're like, what is a discipleship pathway? So what is it? And then what does it look like for you guys?
So simply put, like, a discipleship pathway is just a system and the environment you intentionally create as a church to make disciples. And that's going to look different for every church. It should look different for every church and context based on the culture you're in, the environment you're in. People are a little bit different in Irvine, California than Wilson, North Carolina.
Yeah.
And so the environments we use, right, are going to have to be different. And so when we say discipleship pathway, it's not like, tell me the 3 things you do. It should be, what's the system and the environments we can get people in my context, in your context, to help them make disciples who make disciples.
Yeah. One of the things that you're touching on, which is, I didn't really realize it. I think it was at a conference when this was kind of posed to me. They said, you know what, take an inventory. And this is what they asked me to do. They said, grab one of your church's bulletins, PDFs, just your weekly handout, and look at it in and from the context of, is it a roadmap or is it a menu? And we found that we were giving people a menu every week.
Yeah.
And it was, you pick what makes you happy. Pick the things that are going to bring joy to your life. And, and again, we had, concerts, and you could feed the homeless, and you could, there was so many opportunities to be busy and feel good. And most people would engage in those as they, as they found it, but if it was a la carte, you're talking almost like a hometown buffet style Christianity. Like, well, I don't want those peas. Those look like they've been sitting there for a while. And I don't know, how long ago was that sushi made? And so you can just kind of pass by it thinking it's not a big thing. It's not a big deal.
Kind of like basket weaving's my thing. Do you guys have a ministry for that?
Well, and we still get that. You probably still get that too, Aaron. Like this, what do you have for my specifically nuanced time frame, life situation? It's not about the global kind of overarching mindset of disciple making. It's like, well, I need you to minister in this very nuanced category. And if you don't have that for me, why do you hate me? Why do you hate the church?
Dude, we get that all the time. And what you're hitting on is so important, because this is the mistake we were making, is even in creating culture, was people didn't want it because they have always gotten what they wanted the whole time they were here. And it was almost like we were operating, our job is to provide you what you think you want.
Yeah.
But discipleship isn't giving people what they think they want. It's giving them what they need to follow Christ, whether they want it or not. And it's just why Jesus, of course, turns so many people away, because he's not like, oh, you don't want to really do this? Fine. The rich young ruler, you don't have to sell everything. We'll make it easy for you.
Yeah.
Instead, it's a call to die to yourself and follow him. And man, that's hard when you're dealing with an established church culture that's used to the buffet. Like, it's still a battle for sure.
Aaron, so give us kind of just a 30,000 foot view. A person comes in the doors of Peace Church for the first time. What's it look like for that person to work their way through your discipleship pathway?
Yeah, so our pathway is summed up in 4 words. 3 of them are commitments to the church, and 1 is lifestyle. We say know, grow, serve, and go. So know is a commitment to come to our corporate worship that Sunday morning for us, and so we value that time. That's a part of your discipleship, is to be corporately worshiping. The second environment is grow, where we say you're going to really root yourself in God is through community. And so there's 2 group environments that are the primary functions for that. Are life groups, which are more like most people's traditional small groups as far as in-home facilitated small groups. And then our D groups, which are smaller environments of 3 to 5 of the same gender that goes deeper, and it's more based on weekly disciplines that you're practicing and holding each other accountable to that. And so you've got know and grow, and then serve. That is, man, find your gifts. What's God called you to do, and serve in ministry. That can be through the church. It could be other areas. But just finding their place, because disciples don't just sit inward, they serve. And then that last word, go, is a lifestyle commitment, because we want to create margin in people's schedules. If they're at the church every day, there's no margin to meet lost people. There's no margin to live on mission. And so we want to equip people to say, who can you reach? Who's your go list? Who's the people in your life that are far from Christ that you can bring in? And so even the way we illustrate our pathways in a circular motion, because they're all on ramps to each other. If I'm living on mission, I might invite somebody to my house for my small group. If I'm living on mission, I might bring them to church on Sunday, and they feed each other. And so there's different entry points in that way, but that's essentially what it is. Know, grow, serve, and go for us.
That's so good. So maybe could you share, I know you shared a story of success just a moment ago. There's families that moved across the country, but obviously that doesn't happen with everyone, and that's not God's plan for everyone. But what are some other successes that you've seen of maybe some people there that are still in the church? They're in Wilson, North Carolina, but going through this pathway and being disciple in these relational communities, these spaces, has really made an impact on their life, and you guys are seeing fruit now.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the things of people. It's either people who were never serious about following Christ, they were nominal Christians at best, and then getting on fire and then owning that mission. So many stories of that, or even people who were lost who got saved here. There's one guy in particular, he just posted something on Facebook today, so it's kind of fresh in my mind. Like several years ago, he comes to church, he's led to Christ through a relationship that he develops. He ends up getting into a life group, and out of that builds community and gets involved in a D group. And so he's posting like things today about like what God's been teaching him in his word, and tells like on social media, he's like, if you're not living this kind of life, if you're not following Christ and serious, like you're missing out. And this is a guy who 5 years ago was addicted to alcohol. I mean, it was all over the place. And now he's living a life in surrender to Christ and has discipled people. It's just amazing when you see that sort of genuine life change. And even our mission statement as a church, we want to help everyday people experience life change through Christ-centered relationships. We're communicating the goal is I reach people through those relationships, bring Christ into it, and help people experience life change. And so seeing stuff like that is really cool, where he comes to church, gets in a group, and it just goes deeper from there.
That's awesome. One of the things, and when you were talking about that, I was thinking back to personally, just 2 weeks ago, I had a guy come to the church, and it was interesting. He wanted me to sell him on our church. And he kind of said, why should I come here? Because he was a visitor. He stayed till the end to talk to me. Yeah. And then he almost wanted a commercial for why your brand of church is better than my current brand or where I'm at. And I started diving into some questions that really showed me he was, for lack of a better term, he was looking at me as a customer service manager.
Yeah.
Well, how are you going to make my stay, my experience better? Why do I give my tithe here? What's my return?
Yeah.
And there was this kind of moment where I'm like, there are so many in the American evangelical church that look at their church and their pastor not as a shepherd to the sheep, not as the one who's an under shepherd of the good shepherd, but really a customer service manager, somebody who's going to be there for you in every situation, who's going to say all the right words at the right time, exactly when you need them, to give you the feels.
Yeah.
to have the right concert at the right time, to give you that, excitement and boost when you need it.
Mm-hmm.
And the church is so not that.
Mm-hmm.
and I'm seeing that with you, Aaron. Like you're in this place of like, we're showing people the roadmap. We're showing people the path. Jump on it.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, like, then you're just a consumer.
Mm-hmm.
You're no longer going to be a contributor to the mission of the Great Commission.
Yeah.
You're just going to be a taker and a user. But it's hard work, right? It's tedious work. It's, when we were talking to Ron in our last podcast about the missing engine, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to make it all pretty on the front, but if we don't have the nuts and bolts to receive people in the right way, we're going to really miss out on life change.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the thing is about that view of church, what you were describing, man, that's boring. I'll just be honest. Like, there's no greater sense of purpose in that beyond what I want. And man, like, there's something about when you call people to a mission that's so much greater than themselves that they can actually see. It captivates them in a way. And it's not because it's a leadership principle. I mean, in some ways it is, I guess, but it's just Jesus. Like, that's what made Jesus captivating. He was out to change the world versus I want what I want. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I absolutely agree. I think we're all seeing that more and more with people getting bored in the church, the flashing lights, the great show, all these kind of things, just not doing it for them anymore, just needing something
Well, they're
more.
leaving with no purpose.
Right. And when they recognize and they realize, wait a second, I've been invited into the greatest mission that the world has ever known, the Great Commission. I've been invited into this mission that thousands before me have been on, that Jesus himself has commissioned me to be on. When there's that identity moment of, wait a second, I am a disciple and I'm also a disciple maker, then it's like they enter into this whole new level of purpose and identity of like, wait a second, I do have something I'm supposed to be involved in. And church is not just a bunch of meetings where people get together and talk. It's got mission and purpose and meaning beyond that. And that's what we're talking about. That's why we're all so passionate about this. That's why we're, giving our life to do this. Aaron, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, and something interesting about when people see success in those things, even people who have been maybe resistant or just, apprehensive to jump on whatever the pathway looks like in your context, is when they see it, it begins to stir something in them too. Last Easter, we baptized 20 people on Easter. And I remember there was a guy in our church who emailed our lead pastor later, and he said, man, like, you guys have been talking about this discipleship stuff for a while, and it's not that I disagree. It's just kind of hard for me. He's like 80. And he said, but if that's what it produces, I want to see more of that. And man, he could have left the church and said, I want to be a part of something more comfortable, but he sees the value in part because he watched an entire family get baptized. I mean, that was really cool where the mom and dad got in a D group. They give their hearts over to Christ in new ways and their kids get saved. Like, it's just that kind of stuff stirs whenever they see something. So even the detractors can become cheerleaders when they see God move in that way.
Yeah. So, Aaron, we've got maybe a couple more minutes. Give us, you've got a pastor, you got someone who's listening to the podcast today, and they're agreeing with everything we're talking about. They want to make that shift in their church. Where do they start? What do they need to do first? Give us some first steps for them.
So I think your pathway has to be built out of your philosophy of discipleship, your context, and your vision. And a lot of churches exist without having any of those things, or maybe, and obviously you have a context, but you got to know your context first. Then you've got to develop a philosophy of discipleship. One of the things I love about Bonhoeffer Project is you guys do such a good job of giving people kind of frameworks and allowing the individual places. But I think there is got to be some core commitments to my philosophy. So for example, if I think disciples are produced because they get smart, then I'm going to create a bunch of classroom environments or send them to seminary. But if I believe like Jesus, who really practiced a form of like relational discipleship, investing in people in even smaller contexts, his 12 disciples, and then James, Peter, John is 3 out of that, then that's going to affect the kind of environments I want to create. And so if you're listening, you've got to know, what is my philosophy of discipleship? How do I believe the Bible teaches disciples should be made? What did Jesus do? And then form your convictions out of that. And then based on that and your context, you can create a vision for your church that says, here's how we're going to achieve this. And our pathway gets us to that vision. There's a really helpful resource that has been out there that we actually walked through as a church to help us do this. It's oh man, I'm going blank. Church Unique by Will Mancini. He that's more of the vision part. It's not necessarily the pathway, but there is elements of that. And so I think that's a good place to start. And then you've got to also then think from that, what environments will help me create the type of disciples and the form of discipleship that we believe according to our conviction based on our philosophy of discipleship.
Amen. And that's a great segue to just mention to you listening about the Bonhoeffer Project. Obviously, it's one of those, again, I used it. I know Stephen went through it as well. It's a great opportunity. Our tagline is we turn leaders into disciple makers. So if you want to know more about the Bonhoeffer Project, if you are sparked in any way by what you've heard here today, I encourage you to go to thebonhoefferproject.com. There you can see our process of turning leaders into disciple makers. I want to thank you, Aaron, for being with us today. Thanks for giving us your time, and we really appreciate it. For those of you listening, again, thebonhoefferproject.com. We ask you to participate in the Great Commission, make disciples. Jesus will build the church. God bless you guys. We'll see you next time.